The clock on the nightstand showed 2:17 a.m., its red numbers glowing like tiny fires in the darkness. David stared at those numbers, watching them change every 60 seconds, marking another minute of sleep that wouldn't come. He had been lying, in bed for over 3 hours now, his mind racing like a car engine that wouldn't turn off. This wasn't new. Sleep had become his enemy over the past few weeks. Every night was the same story. He would climb into bed feeling tired, close his eyes, and then his brain would start working overtime. Thoughts about work, bills, that conversation he had with his neighbor, the weird noise his car was making, what he needed to buy at the grocery store tomorrow. Round and round these thoughts went, like a carousel that never stopped spinning. David rolled over and pulled his pillow over his head, trying to block out the world. But even with his ears covered, he could still hear everything. The apartment building was old, and it had its own language of sounds at night. Somewhere above him, Mrs. Peterson was watching late-night television again. The volume was turned down low, but he could still hear the muffled voices and occasional laugh track. To his left, through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's refrigerator humming. Outside, a car drove by every few minutes, its headlights briefly sweeping across his ceiling through the gaps in his curtains. He threw the pillow aside and sat up in bed, running his hands through his messy hair. The sheets were twisted around his legs from all his tossing and turning. His t-shirt was slightly damp with sweat, even though the spring air coming through his cracked window was cool and fresh. Writing used to be his escape. For years, whenever life got overwhelming, he could sit at his desk and let the words flow onto paper. Stories would pour out of him like water from a faucet. But lately that faucet had run dry. He would sit at his computer for hours, staring at a blank screen, typing a few sentences and then deleting them. The cursor would blink at him mockingly, waiting for words that just wouldn't come. His publisher had been patient so far, but David knew that patience had limits. The deadline for his new book was getting closer every day, and he had barely written 20 pages. Good pages were even fewer. Most of what he had written felt forced and lifeless, like trying to squeeze water from a stone. David got up and walked to his small kitchen, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum floor. He opened the refrigerator and stood there in its pale light, not really looking for anything, just enjoying the cool air on his face. The fridge was mostly empty. Some leftover pizza from 2 days ago, a carton of milk that was probably going bad, and a few energy drinks he had bought in a desperate attempt to boost his creativity. None of it looked appealing. He closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter, looking around his small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was his. 1 bedroom, a tiny living room with a desk by the window, a kitchen just big enough for 1 person, and a bathroom that had seen better days. The rent was affordable, and it was quiet during the day, which was all he really needed as a writer. Or had been, back when he could actually write. The apartment felt different at night, though. Shadows gathered in corners during the day seemed to come alive after dark. The familiar couch and bookshelf and coffee table all looked strange and unfamiliar in the dim light. Even the smell was different. During the day, it smelled like coffee and the lavender air freshener he had bought. At night, it smelled older, moustier, like secrets hiding in the walls. David walked back to his bedroom, stopping to look at his desk on the way. His laptop sat there, closed and silent. A stack of notebooks filled with story ideas from better days lay beside it. He had tried reading through those notes last week, hoping to spark some inspiration, but even his old ideas seemed flat and boring now. It was like looking at photographs of a vacation you barely remembered taking. He settled back into bed and stared up at the ceiling fan. It turned slowly, lazily, making a soft whooshing sound with each rotation. He had counted those rotations many nights recently. It was better than counting sheep and more accurate than his bedside clock. The fan had been making a slight clicking noise for months now. He kept meaning to fix it, but somehow never got around to it. Tonight that little click was driving him crazy. Click, whoosh, click, whoosh, click, whoosh. His eyes followed the fan blades around and around. Sometimes he would try to focus on just one blade, watching it disappear into blur and then emerge, again on the other side. It was hypnotic, but not enough to make him sleep. Nothing seemed to be enough for that anymore. The building settled around him with small creaks and groans. These old apartments were like living things, expanding and contracting with the temperature, breathing through their walls and floorboards. During his first week here, those sounds had kept him awake. Now they were as familiar as his own heartbeat. Usually they were comforting, but tonight everything felt different. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He had felt it all day, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. It wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, just different. Electric. Like the moment right before lightning strikes when all the hair on your arm stands up and you know something big is about to happen. He closed his eyes and tried one more time to find sleep. But instead of darkness, his mind filled with images and half-formed thoughts that didn't quite make sense, colors that didn't have names, sounds that seemed to come from somewhere far away. And strangest of all, the feeling that he wasn't alone in his small apartment, even though he knew perfectly well that he was. The clock now read 2:31 a.m. Just another sleepless night in a long string of sleepless nights. But something deep in his chest told him that this night would be different from all the others. He just didn't know how yet. David's eyes snapped open. He hadn't realized he had drifted off, but the clock now showed 2:47 a.m. Something had woken him up, but he couldn't figure out what. The apartment was quieter now. Mrs. Peterson's television had finally gone silent, and even the usual street sounds seemed muted, as if the world outside had been wrapped in cotton. He lay perfectly still, listening. His heart was beating faster than normal, the way it did when you wake up from a dream you can't quite remember but know was important. There was a strange warmth in the room that hadn't been there before. The cool spring breeze from his cracked window seemed to have stopped completely. That's when he noticed his bedroom door. David always kept that door closed at night. It was a habit from childhood, something about feeling safer in a completely enclosed space. But now the door stood slightly open, maybe 6 inches, creating a dark gap that seemed to breathe with shadows. He stared at that gap, trying to remember if he had left it open when he came back from the kitchen earlier. No, he was certain he had closed it. He always did. So how had it opened? Old buildings settled, doors sometimes swung on loose hinges, but this felt different. Deliberate. David sat up slowly, the bed springs creaking softly under his weight. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He was about to get up and close the door when movement caught his eye. At first it was just a shift in the shadows near his dresser, a change in the darkness that made his eyes strain to focus. He rubbed them, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the shadow had shape. Human shape. Someone was standing in his room. David's breath caught in his throat, but strangely, he didn't feel afraid. He should have been terrified. A stranger in his apartment in the middle of the night should have sent him scrambling for his phone or shouting for help. Instead, he felt calm, almost peaceful, like finding something he had lost a long time ago. The figure stepped forward into the dim light filtering through his curtains. It was a woman, maybe in her 20s, with long hair that seemed to catch and hold what little light there was in the room. She wore no clothes, but there was nothing shameful or wrong about it. She looked as natural and comfortable as a person stepping out of a warm bath. Her skin had a soft glow to it, like she was lit from within by some gentle light. When she saw David looking at her, she smiled and let out a quiet laugh. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, like music boxes and wind chimes and distant church bells all mixed together. David opened his mouth to speak, to ask who she was or how she had gotten into his apartment, but no words came out. It wasn't that he couldn't speak. It was that speaking seemed unnecessary. Looking at her, he felt like he already knew her, like she had been part of his life for years instead of seconds. She moved with grace, each step deliberate and smooth. Her feet made no sound on his wooden floor. As she came closer, David could see her eyes clearly. They were kind and understanding, like the eyes of someone who had seen all the sadness and joy in the world and had made peace with both. The woman stopped at the foot of his bed and tilted her head slightly, as if asking permission for something. David found himself nodding, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. All he knew was that this felt right, like the most natural thing in the world. She moved around to the side of his bed with the same graceful steps. Up close, David could see small details that made her seem more real, not less. Tiny freckles across her nose, the way her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The mattress dipped slightly as she sat on the edge of the bed. David felt the weight of her, solid and warm and completely real. Whatever was happening, this wasn't a dream or a hallucination. She was actually here, in his room, in his life. She looked into his eyes for a long moment, and David felt something inside his chest loosen. For weeks, he had been carrying around a tight knot of worry and frustration and exhaustion. Now, under her gentle gaze, that knot began to untangle. Without breaking eye contact, she slowly moved to position herself on his chest. David's first instinct was to tense up, but her touch was so light and careful that he found himself relaxing instead. She settled against him like a cat finding the perfect spot in a patch of sunlight. Her weight was real, but not heavy. It felt like being held by warmth itself. David could feel his racing heart beginning to slow for the first time in weeks. The constant buzz of anxiety that had been his companion lately started to fade away. She placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. Her skin was warm and soft, and David felt that warmth spread outward from the point of contact. It moved through his chest, down his arms, into his stomach, until his whole body felt wrapped in comfort. They stayed like that without speaking. David found that he didn't need words to communicate with her. Somehow she understood exactly what he had been going through. The sleepless nights, the creative block, the feeling of being lost and disconnected from everything that used to matter. To him, she knew it all, and more importantly, she accepted it all. For the first time in months, David's mind went completely quiet. The endless stream of worries and what-ifs and should-haves simply stopped. There was only this moment, this connection, this strange and beautiful woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. He could feel her breathing, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of his own. Her hair tickled his chin slightly, and he caught a scent like spring rain and fresh flowers. Everything about her presence felt healing, like medicine for a sickness he had carried so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be well. Time seemed to stretch and bend around them. Minutes might have passed, or hours. David didn't care. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. The woman's presence filled all the empty spaces inside him that he hadn't even realized were there. As they lay together in the quiet darkness, David felt something shift deep inside him. The creative energy that had been blocked for so long began to stir again, not urgently or demandingly, but gently, like a stream starting to flow again after winter ice melts away. Words and images and stories began to form at the edges of his consciousness, waiting patiently for their turn to be born. The woman seemed to sense this change in him. She lifted her head and smiled, and in that smile, David saw understanding and encouragement and something that might have been pride. Then she settled back against his chest and they returned to their peaceful silence, two beings sharing a moment that existed outside of normal time and space. David closed his eyes and, for the first time in weeks, felt sleep approaching naturally and easily. But this time, he wasn't afraid of missing something important. Whatever was happening between them would continue, awake or asleep. Some connections, he was beginning to understand, existed deeper than consciousness. David woke up naturally without an alarm, which hadn't happened in months. Sunlight was streaming through his bedroom window, painting golden rectangles on his wooden floor. He stretched his arms above his head and realized something amazing. He felt rested. Actually truly rested, like he had slept for 12 hours straight instead of the usual few minutes here and there. His body felt different too. The constant tension he carried in his shoulders was gone. The tight feeling in his chest that had been his companion for weeks had disappeared completely. Even his breathing felt easier, deeper, like he had been holding his breath for a long time and had finally remembered how to let it out. David sat up in bed and looked around his room. Everything looked brighter somehow, more alive. The morning, light seemed warmer, and even the old furniture looked fresh and welcoming. It was like seeing his own apartment for the first time, or like putting on glasses after years of blurry vision. Then the memories came flooding back. The woman, the mysterious visitor who had appeared in his room and somehow healed something, broken inside him. David looked around quickly, expecting to see her still there, but he was alone. The room was empty except for him and the dancing dust particles in the sunbeams. Had it been a dream? It had felt so real, so vivid. He could still remember every detail. The way she moved, the sound of her gentle laughter, the warmth of her touch on his chest. But now, in the clear light of morning, it seemed impossible. People didn't just appear in locked apartments. Beautiful strangers didn't show up in the middle of the night to provide comfort and healing. David was about to dismiss the whole experience as an incredibly vivid dream when he noticed something that made his breath catch. There was still an impression in the mattress beside him. The sheets were wrinkled and pushed down like someone had been lying there. He reached over and touched the spot. It was still slightly warm. His heart started beating faster. He got out of bed and walked around to examine the other side more closely. The evidence was clear. Someone had definitely been there. The pillow still held a slight depression from where a head had rested. A few long strands of hair lay across the white pillowcase, catching the morning light like copper wire. David picked up one of the hairs and held it up to the window. It was real, solid, undeniably there, auburn-colored and silky soft between his fingers. He had never seen hair quite that color before. It was like autumn leaves and honey mixed together. He noticed something else that confirmed his experience hadn't been a dream. His bedroom door was still slightly open, just as he had found it the night before. David always closed that door. Always. It was automatic, like brushing his teeth or turning off lights. But there it was, standing open like an invitation. Cookie. Strangest thing of all was how he felt. The creative block that had been torturing him for months was completely gone. His mind felt clear and sharp, like fog lifting from a mountaintop. Ideas were already starting to form, stories and characters and scenes appearing in his imagination as naturally as flowers blooming in spring. David walked to his desk and opened his laptop. Without even thinking about it, his fingers started moving across the keyboard. Words flowed out of him like water from a broken dam. Not just any words, but good words. Powerful words that painted pictures and told stories and captured emotions he had been trying to express for years. He wrote for 2 hours straight, only stopping when his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. When he looked at what he had written, David couldn't believe it. It was some of the best work he had ever done. The characters felt real, the dialogue was natural, and the story had a life and energy that jumped off the screen. This was impossible. Yesterday, he couldn't write a grocery list without struggling. Now he was producing work that felt like it was coming from someone else entirely. Someone more talented, more experienced, more connected to the deeper truths of human experience. David saved his work and leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen in amazement. Something had definitely happened last night. Something that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Whether it was a dream, a vision, or something else entirely didn't matter. What mattered was the result. He looked at the strand of hair still clutched in his other hand. Physical evidence of an impossible night. David carefully placed it in a small wooden box on his desk, next to his pens and notebooks. Whatever had happened, whoever she had been, he wanted to remember every detail. 3 months later, David's life had completely transformed. The insomnia that had plagued him for years was gone. Every night, he fell asleep easily and woke up, refreshed. His dreams were vivid and peaceful, filled with colors and stories that often inspired his writing the next day. His creativity had exploded beyond anything he had ever experienced. The novel he had been struggling with for months was not only finished but was the best thing he had ever written. His editor had called it brilliant, magical, and unlike anything she had seen before. Publishers were interested, and there was already talk of a movie deal. But the changes went deeper than just his work. David felt more connected to the world around him. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, and conversations with friends and neighbors felt more meaningful. It was as if someone had turned up the volume on life itself. He still thought about her every day, the mysterious woman who had appeared in his room that night. Sometimes he would catch himself looking for her in crowds, hoping to see that familiar face, that gentle smile. He had tried researching similar experiences online and was surprised to find he wasn't alone. There were forums and websites full of people describing similar encounters. Some called them angels. Others said they were spirits or manifestations of healing energy. A few claimed they were visitors from another dimension. The stories varied, but the results were remarkably similar. People reported dramatic improvements in their mental health, creativity, relationships, and overall sense of purpose. David didn't really care what category his experience fell into. He had stopped trying to explain it logically. Some things, in life, he had learned, were meant to be felt rather than understood. The important thing wasn't what she was, but what she had given him. Every morning, David would sit at his desk and touch the small wooden box that held her hair. It had become a ritual, a way of connecting with that night and the transformation it had brought. The hair was still there, still beautiful, still proof that something extraordinary had happened. His writing continued to flow easily. He had already started his second novel, and the ideas came so fast he could barely keep up with them. Critics were calling his work transcendent, saying it touched something universal in the human experience. Readers wrote letters telling him how his stories had changed their lives, helped them through difficult times, made them feel less alone. David knew where that power came from. It came from that night, from her touch, from the healing that had occurred in the quiet darkness of his bedroom. She had given him more than just a good night's sleep. She had given him access to something deeper, something that connected him to the shared experiences and emotions of all people. Sometimes late at night when he was working on a particularly difficult scene, David would feel a familiar warmth on his chest. Just for a moment he would sense her presence again, encouraging him, guiding his words. He would look up from his computer, half expecting to see her standing there, but he was always alone. David had come to accept that he might never see her again. Perhaps she had been exactly what he needed for that one moment in time, and now her work was done. Maybe she had moved on to help someone else who was lost and struggling in the darkness. But her impact remained. Every successful day, every beautiful sentence he wrote, every peaceful night of sleep was a gift from her. David carried that gift forward, trying to pass on some of the healing and inspiration he had received to everyone whose life his work touched. The wooden box on his desk had become more than just a keepsake. It was a reminder that the world was full of mystery and possibility. That help could come from the most unexpected places, that sometimes when we need it most, someone or something appears to show us that we are not alone. David often wondered if he would ever fully understand what happened that night. But he had learned that understanding wasn't always necessary. Sometimes it was enough to simply be grateful and to use the gifts we receive to make the world a little brighter for others. As he continued writing, sharing stories that touched hearts and changed lives, David knew that the mysterious woman's work was continuing through him. In every reader who found comfort in his words, in every person who felt less alone after reading his stories, her healing touch lived on. And that, David realized, might have been the point all along.